All right. Welcome back to Waste Some Time with Jason Green. I am Jason Green. We're bringing you brand new interviews every Monday and Friday right here on YouTube. Now, all you got to do is subscribe. You hit the subscribe button, you'll find out that there's brand new interviews every Monday and Friday. And if you go on the channel, you can binge watch because there's about 60 interviews right now, all kinds of different actors, musicians, everything. There's all kinds of stuff. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. I've fallen into this 80s, 70s, 80s punk rock rabbit hole. Growing up on the East Coast, I wasn't as familiar with some of these California bands. And I said to our guest today, I wish you weren't so interesting because I've been up for nights now just studying this person's career and the whole scene. We're talking to Kira Roessler. She was best known for being in the band Black Flag at just 21 years of old. How does a girl end up in Black Flag at just 21 years old? And goes on to be a very successful person in the entertainment industry, sound editing. She's an Emmy Award winner. Lots to get to, so I better stop talking. Kira Roessler right after this. Just wanna waste some time with you. Sometimes it seems too good to be true. Nobody out there can waste time with you. All right, here she is. Thank you,
Hello
Kira.
there.
Yeah, appreciate it. I just realized as my punk rock song was playing for one of my punk rock heroes, it was a moment for me.
Oh, well, you know, I'm going to do my best to give you whatever you need, darling.
All right. Well, we got a lot, so we're gonna get started.
Okay. Saddle up.
Yeah. Even though you're known for being part of the West Coast punk scene, as a child, you grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. And you're in New Haven until about 8 years old. Your father is a famous underwater photographer. He became one. I think he just decides, I'm going to change careers and do this. He moves you and your brother, Paul Roessler, who is also a known musician, and we're going to get into him. He moves you guys to the Caribbean. So let's start with that. At 8 years old, from 8 to 11, you're in the Caribbean. Tell me, what's that like?
Well, you know, my father's a rather organized fella. So he, even before we left, you know, did a little work, stuck me in a pool with a tank, you know, I started to study Dutch, my brother and I, because the schools in Curacao where we moved were in Dutch and we were going to have to go to school. So, you know, we knew what we were getting into somewhat in terms of, you know, being a kid. It was going to be pretty much school in the mornings and diving in the afternoons, because that was my father's interest, hobby, and eventually new career. He came from a computer background and just decided to throw it all away and do something more suited to him. So what it was like when we got there was, you know, it was a great cultural experience, because if you've never lived outside of the States, you kind of need to go through that, you know, all of the, you know, things that maybe you're used to having easy access to, you might not have access to, but on the other hand, you get these perspectives that are so new. Like, you know, this is a 80% Black island with a white minority government, you know, which is very common in a lot of places. And so finding yourself as part of this sort of minority government is population, if you will, with all of the interesting racial dynamics was fascinating. And as a kid, it's easy to just start accepting, you know, new ideas. We were going to school from very early morning till noon because the weather there is quite warm. So, and they don't have air conditioning in the school. So we had to sort of get done by noon, which gave us all afternoon to go and scuba dive and have my dad basically leave my brother and I to our own devices underwater so he could get my mom modeling underwater and do his photography. So that was the primary schedule.
This is pretty punk rock already. You know what I mean? I'm going to start a new career and I'm going to take my family to the Caribbean.
Yeah, he's a nonconformist too, just like me.
Yeah, and your brother. I think
and my brother.
I think the influence is obviously there. So you guys were already playing music. You started playing piano first, right? So
correct. I started when I was 6. My brother was 9. We studied classical piano. We moved to Caribbean. We did continue studying piano, classical, and my brother started some beginnings of songwriting and playing with other people. I did not. I actually eventually quit piano because I got frustrated, because I got sick and fell behind, and I was an incredibly competitive person, and falling behind my older brother was pretty obviously going to happen, but that didn't stop me from resenting it and quitting. And then for several years I didn't play music until I decided the way to beat him was to play a different instrument and join him and try to join his band.
Yeah, yeah, you and your brother definitely had in your younger years some competition. So it's a smart move. So now you leave at 11 years old. You leave the Caribbean. Now, was that always the plan, that you'll be there for a few years and then you'll move to the West Coast? How does it happen?
So how it happens is my father met a guy who was running a scuba diving travel agency and running scuba diving tours all over the world. And for a while, they brought tours to Curacao where we were living, and my dad would facilitate those trips. And eventually what happened was that they went into business together. He bought into the business, which was located in San Francisco. So we moved to a suburb of San Francisco in order for him to buy into that company and continue running scuba diving tours, and therefore being able to do his photography all over the world, and works for him.
Yeah. So was California the plan next?
It hadn't necessarily been the plan until he met this guy who was running this travel agency in San Francisco.
And so that became the spot. Yeah. So you go to San Francisco for a little while, but you weren't there long, right?
2 years. And then my parents divorced. And as a result, my mom's sister, my aunt, was living in Los Angeles. So she wanted to be closer to, a support system. So she moved my brother and I to Los Angeles, on the west side of Los Angeles, close to where my aunt lived.
And I'm guessing, and I don't want to age you, but I'm guessing this is the mid-70s?
Look, it's fine. I turned 60 this year, and I am not unhappy about that. I would never go back.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, you lived through it. That's another big theme in your career, as many. Do you ever say to yourself, I can't believe I lived through that?
Well, there were certainly moments, but there's also just the wisdom that comes with the experience that I wouldn't give up. You're so ignorant. It's truly what they say about youth being wasted on the young. It's simply that we don't have the perspective to even know to enjoy these things. Do you think I knew that the Caribbean was something to really lock into my memory and enjoy, and was something, so unique and wild? It's after the fact that you start to realize what happened to me. Moving to Los Angeles was the worst thing I could possibly imagine in that time. I mean, as far as I was concerned, it was a gang-ridden city, and I was moving away from my daddy, so it seemed horrible. And of course, wrong again. It was great, and I love Los Angeles, and I'm glad to be living here still.
Well, and some of the things that we're going to get into are things that could never be recaptured. This was a moment in time. The way culture and the way life has changed, these stories would be shocking to people by today's standards, but we'll get there. So I want to talk about, I want to talk about university high school. Okay.
Yes. 10th grade for me.
5th grade?
10th and 10th only.
10th grade. Okay. So you just went for 1 year. At that time, was your brother a senior?
Yes. Although we're 3 years apart, because of the move to Curacao, my brother was held back for a year. We both were held back for a year because of the change in language. And I was able to, because I was younger, jump ahead and get back to my grade, but he was not. So he ended up 2 grades ahead of me. So he was in 12th grade when I moved into 10th grade there at Uni High.
Okay. So yeah, I was wondering about this timeline. Now, Uni High, for those who don't know, has got the craziest alumni in history. And I'm going to name a few. These are just, and we'll start with the actors. Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, Annette Funicello. That's some elite Hollywood. But let's talk about music, because you weren't the only female bass player to go to uni high. The great Kim Gordon, later of Sonic Youth, she also is a graduate. She was
a West LA person, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, and I think Sonic Youth got so known on the East Coast, but obviously she went to school on the West Coast, and she's a little bit older than you, so that was before.
Yeah.
Other musicians who went to your school before you. These are all people who were before you. David Cassidy, Danny Elfman from Oingo Boingo, Robbie Krieger and John Densmore from The Doors. There's something in the water at this school. Kim Fowley, who becomes a big part of the Runaways, and his own stuff. Then we got, now move up a little bit past your time, Eric Avery and Dave Navarro both go on to Jane's Addiction. But we've got to make sure that we mention, so your brother is there, he's a senior, and in his class, and I'm going to go by their stage names, Pat Smear. Pat Smear obviously goes on to the Germs, goes on to Nirvana, and now is in the Foo Fighters, and Darby Crash. And Darby Crash becomes a huge part of your life, of that scene, and to many people. And I think that in some ways, Darby Crash is underrated. You know, people don't know as much about him. I think the people who are fans of that scene do, people who saw the decline of the Western civilization do, but his life is so, and you didn't call him Darby. I mean, you went by.
Well, I did when he changed his name. I mean, look, I was actually still in junior high when my brother met those guys, and I'll never forget the day that Pat came running through the school, calling my name and my best friend's name, Michelle, trying to find us, you know, with glitter and, you know, running through junior high, yelling our names because, you know, he wanted to find us. And we were, at least I was, in class. So we knew them. My brother knew them from 10th grade, you know, so he knew them for years before I even went to uni. And they were part of this sub school called IPS, Innovative Program School, that was sort of a TM affected thing, transcendental meditation, these very sort of foo-foo teachers.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this. Yeah.
It was great. They let you do things like, you know, sort of pick your own curriculum, but also work at your own speed. So you could get through courses with them, you know, if you were applying yourself, you could get through a lot of stuff. Or if you felt like screwing around, I suppose you could not get through a lot of stuff. But I chose to you know, get some credits under my belt while I was in 10th grade at that school. But yeah, they, you know, we sat around on beanbag chairs and, you know, did trust exercises and, you know, all that stuff.
Was there some Scientology related?
Yes, there's a bit of a Scientology background there, although it wasn't, you know, they were careful not to formalize any of their influences. I would say it was kind of like they were a band who had been influenced by TM and Scientology, and not like they were actually trying to indoctrinate us specifically. They had their own ideas and curriculum that was, you know, sort of grown out of their experiences with these cults.
Yeah, no, it's totally bizarre. And I think that some people like Pat and Darby, you know, kind of just what, you know, this is like you were saying, you could just get by. Yeah, okay, I'll believe in this for now. And, you know, I'll come up with projects that are completely bizarre and I'll graduate.
Well, yeah, I mean, and simple things like, you know, it became somewhat of its own little underground, so that if you were a nonconformist, so if you didn't fit into the mold of day-to-day high school life, it allowed for that, you know, sort of side lifestyle that, you know, some people, it's exactly why people were drawn to punk rock. It was, you know, there's this offering of a group of people who aren't trying to fit into some mold that you're not comfortable with anyway. So you're drawn to this alternative.
Yeah, well, it explains why so many artistic people went to this school, maybe, you know, because there's definitely.
Yeah, although IPS was not, you know, a core part of uni for the whole time, obviously. I also graduated Hollywood High, which was no slouch in the famous people department.
Oh yeah, well that's fine. Well, Hollywood High was the one that I always knew. I'm new to the uni world, but yeah, you could talk about there's some punk legends and rock legends who went to Hollywood High.
Well, there are, and but the funny thing was, when I was there, there was one other punk rocker and nobody else who was even slightly alternative at all. And I was frowned upon in every which way. I also went to Van Nuys High in 11th grade, which was really rough because there was just no one, you know, I was a punk rocker and no one sort of even knew what that was. So it just seemed like I was being contrary for contrary's sake, as far as they were concerned, you know. They didn't appreciate.
I can imagine. Well, we're throwing around the word punk, and today that means something. But at the time, this was very new. I mean, you know.
No, it meant nothing. It meant nothing. It just meant like I dressed funny and looked funny. You know, I had dyed my hair black and had a little spikiness to it. And I had straight-legged pants and they all wore bell bottoms. And my clothes were somewhat tattered, but you know, that wasn't even on purpose. That was just, we were a little bit poor because my mom had moved away and my brother and I were living somewhat on our own and not managing money very well. So there was, you know, there was a certain amount of just reality creeping into my attire.
Sure. Well, one of the things I like about you that you say, and I believe it wholeheartedly, is that punk is not really a fashion statement. Punk is a way of life. You're nonconformist and you live it, or you don't. But you can have a mohawk. Most punks I know did not. You could have spikes and things like this, but that doesn't make you a punk. That makes you, I guess now they call that a fashion punk. But you know.
Yeah, I don't know. The labels, all of the labels, you know, are kind of after the fact. You know, which is something that you learn as you gather some wisdom, is that, you know, people now have these ways of categorizing the time frames and what was going on. But the truth is, back then, you know, it wasn't as clear whether. One of the things that fascinated me about this early punk rock thing is, you're right, nobody knows, but there's this little fanzine called Flipside in LA, right? And you start seeing these women who are not in bands. They're purely famous because of how they dress and have this look. And they're on the cover of Flipside magazine, which in this tiny little world is famous.
Yeah.
You know, and that kind of fascinated me, that these women who weren't necessarily standing out for anything else, but they were setting the, you know, trend of how to, you know, appear.
Yeah. And as I was researching, you know, you in this time, you do start to learn these names and you go, well, what made this person stand out? Well, they weren't a musician, but they dated somebody, or they had a look, or they were on the scene.
All the parties were at their house.
You know, Kira, also, one of the things I can't help but notice by going through your timeline is that you're definitely not of age during any of this, these early years.
No, I was not. I was about, my first gig, I was 16. So, yeah, I mean, we were talking about high school. I mean, I was 10th grade, you know, middle of 10th grade, we started, you know, the Germs started playing, which was Darby Crash's band, you know, and we went to our first gig, you know, so we're talking just getting to be 16 and what was going out and drinking and staying out late. And the fact that my parents were around was probably best.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. What a way to live. But what was the drinking?
No, well, it would have been confrontational, is my point. You know, if we had been trying to live that lifestyle, then that's why a lot of kids ended up as runaways and stuff. And in some ways, I was lucky to be somewhat on my own, because there wasn't this problem of I can't live in the home I expected to live in because my parents aren't accepting my choices. You know, I didn't have to go through that particular problem. Right. I had my own problems, like, you know, finances and stuff. But
of course, yeah, you definitely didn't live a traditional lifestyle, though. Was the drinking age 18 or 21 at that time?
It was 21, okay. And I eventually, when I was 18, I had made a fake ID from my my eventual sister-in-law's birth certificate, and was able to get into the clubs. Certain clubs were 21 only, but a lot of the clubs were all ages, but maybe a hand stamp or something that would tell the bartender not to serve you. But they didn't necessarily search for the bottle in your jacket. You know?
It definitely wasn't as strict, I'm sure. You know, nowadays everything is looked after. I remember in New York City going to clubs like the Cat Club or the Limelight or CBGBs. In high school, nobody ever looked for an ID. You know what I mean? It was a different...
Well, there were phases in LA where things got pretty tight. You know, fire marshals would show up and close down shows, and bars would get very strict. Some of the key clubs like the Whiskey or the Starwood would say, like, no more punk rock, you know, right. And that would last for 6 months. And you know, eventually they would miss some of the income of some of the bigger bands because they would sell the clubs out, you know, so.
Well, yeah, because this growing scene needed a place, and we'll talk about some of those places. But so 16 years old, you go to the Whiskey, the world famous Whiskey A Go-Go, to see the Germs. And is that the first show you went to?
Yes, it was. They had a single out, recorded in the garage and at a live show called Forming. And my brother, having been friends with them, you know, learned about this show. And we, a roommate and my brother and I went into Hollywood and went to the gig. I tagged along with my brother on everything. You know, I became a bass player because of my brother. I became a punk rocker because of my brother, you know, and so on and so forth.
Did you, at that show, and I know how the show ends, we'll get to that, but did you see it and say, I've got to do this? I mean, you were already on the way, but.
No, I mean, honestly, I was just tagging along in a way, like any little sister might, you know. It was mostly more, it was more that I didn't have my own, you know, sort of unique path that I glommed onto Paul's path. I actually thought it seemed a little bit insane, you know, that first night. It was a little bit extreme to my taste. I had been a suburb kid until, you know, my mom moved away. So this had all happened kind of quickly.
Well, and for those who don't know, Darby Crash was, you know, innovative in his crazy ways on stage, putting the microphone in peanut butter, cutting himself, these type of things. That night, he steps on some glass and has a pretty major wound in his foot. You end up going to the hospital with him, right?
We drove him. Yeah, we ended up driving him. But you know, it was just some stitches. It seemed very dramatic because, you know, we had to sort of convince him that he needed to get stitches, you know. And of course, if you're into cutting at all, that isn't necessarily how you would expect to, you know, complete the cycle. But in this particular case, he stepped on the bottle that he'd been cutting himself so, you know, it had a little bit more dramatic outcome than he had planned, you know, and he needed some stitches.
Yeah. And right. And of course, and cutting and things like this culture existed. I think now kids discover these things, but this existed back then. And so, yeah, of course, to him, this is not the craziest thing. But when you do it on a live stage, at a legendary venue, you know, where the Doors and all these bands were playing before, and you go to the hospital, this makes great folklore, which is why we're talking about it, you know, this many years.
All these years later, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But so at 16 years old, you play in a band called Wax with 2 X's. And so, and I believe, I could be wrong, your first gig is at the Whiskey.
Yes. It was a Rodney on the Rock Sunday afternoon show with Crime headlining the Dills, which were San Francisco bands, and we got on as openers to that gig.
Did you know? I played the Whiskey. I looked around. Now the history has grown, you know, since you were there. But I look around and go, wow, this place is pretty historic. Did you feel that way? Was it exciting?
I mean, I didn't think of it that way, that venue. I mean, it was early enough. The gig, this particular gig, was early enough that I hadn't even seen a lot of shows there, you know, and I didn't have a lot of history, being that I was then, you know, 15, 14, 13, hadn't gone out to a lot of gigs. So I didn't have that sort of historical perspective. You know, and I was just nervous. It was my first gig ever, and I hadn't been played bass. I picked up the bass at 14 and had played a lot in my room, but hadn't, you know, having not played live, you know, the primary emotion was terror, not wow, right, this is cool, and I'm the historic.
Sure. Well, and many of my heroes didn't exist, hadn't played there at that point. You know, this is still early in the game, so to speak. Your style of bass playing always surprises me a little bit. You know, people who play punk, you expect them to play with a pick, and it's all 16th notes, and this is, but that's not exactly how you played. You played with your fingers, I think, most of your career.
Entirely, yeah.
Yeah, and was there ever a decision about that?
Well, my decision to play the bass was to join my brother's prog rock band. So it just felt more natural when I first picked it up. And dumb me, I thought, hey, I'm left-handed and this is the hard part, right? And then I, you know, played with a drummer and found out how wrong I was about that. But by that time, my hands were sort of malformed enough that I had to stick with it. But the I don't know, the style evolved, I guess, if you could call it a style. I very much try to just react to whatever I'm playing in the moment, you know. So my idea of a good bass player is who plays what's right for that music, you know. But my resistance to playing the obvious bass line probably is my same old nonconformity, you know, too. And then I had I think my biggest influences, I always say this, but it's true, were the people I played with, not necessarily the people I've listened to, and playing with another bass player, Mike Watt, you know, and learning to, you know, sort of find my ways around rhythms and stuff, you know, was hugely influential in my later playing.
Yeah, and we'll get to that because your style of playing has changed. And you mentioned Mike Watt, you know, who's a legend in his own right, and we'll talk about that. But yeah, your style has definitely evolved, and you did have to play to fit the music. And bands like Black Flag were not your typical punk band. I think people thought it was. You know, they sounds like it would be, but these.
Well, and in that band, I very much wasn't creative at all. I did exactly what Greg told me to do. Yes. You know, I mean, he would show me the riff, even if it was going to be one of our instrumental sort of jam type riffs, he would show me the riff, and my job was to hold down the fort so that he could have fun, you know. It's so in that band, it was not, I wouldn't even call it a style. It was just hold on for dear life, right, you know, and hold it down, you know.
And create no rhythm guitar player, it's just you. So when he's soloing, it's you playing. Were there bass players that you liked at that time, like that you saw and go, hey, that one's pretty cool?
Like I said, it very much had to do with the right bass player, you know, the right bass lines, you know, and I admire people who do what's right. I mean, Paul McCartney plays the exact correct bass lines for the Beatles, you know, or, you know, ZZ Top's bass player does what that bass player needs to do, you know, and Geezer Butler, you know, it goes on, right? It's almost best if it's felt and not heard in a lot of cases, you know, and if it is a band where the bass, you know, like the Minutemen or something like that, where the bass is more of a functional part of the songwriting and the part of the sound, then that needs to also be stepping out at every juncture and not falling into the hole. You know, there's a time to fall into the holes of the band, and there's a time to stand out. You know, the worst thing you could do is try to grab all the attention when the attention isn't meant to be on the bass. You know.
Yeah, no, and that's a wise way to look at it, especially as a kid. You know, which is you were, but again, the punk rock bass playing really had just begun. You're kind of in it from the beginning, you know, and you learn what you learn. You can't go, well, I'm going to copy. You know, I mean, there were some guys, but not so much nowadays. Someone can pick up bass and go, I'm going to play like Dee Dee Ramone. I'm going to play like, you know, Klaus from the Dead Kennedys. You know, I'm going to play like Kira. You know, now it's a different thing. So now this is where the timeline gets tricky. You're the expert. So there's a couple places. There's the Mask, which is a legendary venue, which is in the basement of the Pussycat Theater. And now the Pussycat Theater, in the olden days, you can watch adult movies on a big screen, and somebody like John Holmes' name would be bigger than the woman's name who's in these movies. Or Deep Throat, these movies were treated as if they were major releases. They would play on 35 millimeter. So you were working at the Mask at one point, right?
Well, yes. I mean, look, it was the only game in town for some time. And when I was in 12th grade going to Hollywood High, one of the challenges of being in a band was to have a practice place, right? So the guy who ran the Mask, who basically booked the gigs, and, you know, he also had practice places in the Mask during the day. And so I convinced him, as sort of a trade-off, to let me have free practice time if I basically hung out there and did the rental, you know, rented out the stuff and helped, you know, sort of just have a presence so that he didn't have to be there every single hour of the day. So he basically only paid me with free practice time, and he would bring me lunch. That was the other request, because cash was, you know, scarce. So I would go there after school, which by then in 12th grade, I didn't have a lot of classes left because I had been able to get my credits going early. So I would spend the afternoon attending the band's coming and goings and making sure that people get into the rooms they needed to get into. And then, you know, that way we had the band I was in at the time would have practice space, you know. And so
a lot of these bands,
yay me.
Yeah, no, smart. You were ahead of your time. A lot of these bands that are coming in go on to be pretty legendary people, you know. Not everyone succeeded. One of the things I've learned about researching some of the bands that played it is that a lot of them never had an album. You know, they call it unrecorded bands. And these are bands that are very influential and sort of legendary to that scene. But I got to mention, so there's bands like the Go-Go's that go on to be a huge pop band. But at the time, Belinda Carlisle, she was the Germs' first drummer, never plays a show. She was called Dottie Danger at the time. And what's funny is, so she misses their first show literally because of Germs. She has mono, and problem of the youth, right? Yeah. And so you were seeing the Go-Go's when they were a punk band, and I should recommend to anyone who hasn't heard their punk music, you can still find the demos. I think it's great. It's really fun stuff and totally different than.
Well, I think I was in the room when they decided to have a band. You know, I mean, they were, you know, these girls. Some of them. Don't let me be incorrect. Charlotte was in a band called The Eyes. She was a bass player I admired, and she decided to play rhythm guitar. Go figure. You know. But anyways, they kind of like, let's start a band, you know, and I'll play this, I'll play that, you know, and I have to admit that, you know, my eyes would kind of roll, and you know, it's like, because it felt a little bit different. I mean, my approach was still somewhat from a musical background, you know, so I did think of things in terms of, you know, maybe you want to be able to play the instrument you're choosing to play, or be able to tune it or something like that, and so there was judgment attached to them at the beginning, because I thought, especially as a girl, you don't want to be the one who doesn't know how to tune or can't get your bass to make sound, or you know what I mean? Like it was kind of important to me to understand signal flow and attenuation of your bass and stuff like that. It was to me a little bit more of a serious thing. I mean, it sounds absurd looking back at it, but I took it a little more seriously, and so there was, but yeah, I mean, they came from the punk rock scene, and they were very raw for a variety of reasons, some of which being not having the skill set per se, but also being influenced by the bands that they were seeing play at the Mask that night, so and they had a room. Like some bands had actual monthly rental at the Mask, and they had dedicated rooms, and then there were a couple of rooms that were more hourly rooms, and there was some gear that you could rent as well.
Yeah, it's if you look at some of the pictures of these places, it paints a picture. But just talking about these smoky, dirty places, we talk about these legendary venues like a CBGB's as if it was this great place. No, it was a dump. It was nothing nice about it.
It was a basement. It was a basement.
Yeah,
that's what it was. It was a low ceiling basement. The main room where the gigs happened, which was just a low ceiling, sort of hall type room with a very low stage at one end and a crappy little PA system,
and a porn theater on top of you.
Well, the porn theater, yes. Well, yeah, but we didn't. I mean, that wasn't something that that wasn't really that much of an impact.
Did you ever go to the Pussycat Theater?
No, of course not. I was just a kid. I was a kid.
So you say, like that would be crazy, but there are so many other things that are crazy. So the Germs, we're jumping around, but we're getting to the heart of things. The Germs' first album, Germs' only album, it's produced by Joan Jett.
Yeah.
So Joan Jett is already famous. I know people know Joan Jett as a kid, but the Runaways is before this. And
yes.
She's done with the Runaways. I don't think people even realize that at one point, she fronted the Runaways on the last two albums. I know people know Joan Jett from now, and the punk fans watching this are rolling their eyes saying, of course we know this. But you tell me, and you already know where I'm going with the story, but you tell me how you meet Joan Jett.
Well, so I actually tried to go to a Runaways gig at the Starwood. I think I was 13, and they wouldn't let me in the door, and I ended up having to walk home from Hollywood to the West Side. Pat and Darby we were in this whole group of people, and the older of them got into the gig, and I did not. So I mean, so my background was an awareness of who these people were. But I didn't really know her. I mean, I had a couple of small interactions with her. There was this party. I got to know her there just briefly.
Where was the party? Was that the Canterbury Apartments?
No, it was at the Plunger Pit, which is one of these places I was telling you about, where these girls who were called the Plungers, who were not in a band, just were all really cool chicks, were roommates and had a Hollywood apartment. And after some show, it was like, well, the party's at the Plunger Pit, and I was there, and there was a room where the girls were making out, and I met Joan there briefly. And I think one other time she came to a practice of my all-girl band, Sexic. I think Michelle, my partner in the band, had gotten her to come down and check it out. So, but I mean, she doesn't, we don't know each other at all.
Well, that's what I've always wondered. And before I ask if you've ever crossed paths, so we should point out, because you said it and you know what I'm going to say, that you've only sexually been involved with one woman in your life, and that woman is Joan Jett. Now,
Yeah, that was at that party. You know, I don't even know if she would remember, so I feel bad even, you know, saying it. But you know, for me, it was there was a curiosity there. She was as butch as any girl. I thought it was a good starting point to check it out. And like I said, there was this room where the girls were making out. So I was sort of, you know, it was in my mind. I'd had some alcohol, and so that happened. And what I discovered for myself was that wasn't really my leaning sexually, but it was something I was very open to exploring, and who better with which to explore.
I have to say, yeah, I agree. And I've got a million questions, but I don't want to go too into it. But so this experience ends. Do you exchange numbers or?
Nope. It was, you know, again, she was famous. Like you said, at the time I was, you know, I was absolutely nobody and just some chick at a party, you know, so some young girl at a party.
Well, that's the other thing we should point out. I'm just guessing you can't be much more than 16,
17 maybe. Yeah, maybe. And so and when I met her later, I was probably 19. I'm not even sure. And I've been trying to remember. I'm not even sure that we connected those dots when I met her later.
You connected something, Kira.
I mean, I don't know that we even talked about the fact that we had met before at the practice place where she just came to watch my band practice. Because I guess we were an all-girl band. I don't even remember how that happened, but I do remember her being at a practice once.
Yeah, well, you made the best of the situation. And we should point out, though, that experimentation at this time is huge. Like you were saying, girls are going off into rooms, and you know, and the Runaways, Sherry Curry claims that she left the band because they were all lesbians and that they, you know, they were hooking up with each other or whatever. You know, so it's not like this isn't this crazy story, but for a young person, Joan Jett is a rock star. And like you said, if you're going to experiment, what a cool person to experiment with. I have to think.
I mean, the groupie thing was happening, you know, with a lot of the band. I mean, that's a thing, right? The groupie mentality is something that kind of happens, and and girls get enamored with someone, you know, who played that night or whatever. You know, this stuff was happening all the time. So, you know, it was easy for me to fall into a groupie status here and there as it would be for anyone, especially before I had actually had any kind of success myself, you know. But it's a little embarrassing after the fact because of the obvious sort of implications of what it might do to a young girl to be too active, you know, too early and with too many adults and stuff.
Well, do you think that was a problem with you? I feel like it wasn't. I feel like you weren't overly sexual, but I don't know. I wasn't there.
I was a tomboy, but I was, you know, I fell into the wrong behaviors just as much as other people did, and I had some disappointments after the fact with some of the men in most cases that were adults and maybe could have known better and understood that maybe I wasn't, you know, really fully able to make the decision, as now very clearly defined by law that you can't consent. And I kind of get that. And back then, you know, statutory rape wasn't really a thing, but it kind of should be a thing. And that's all I mean is like there's a little bit of discomfort with the fact that, you know, if nothing else, that I was enabling that kind of behavior, if not being abused by that behavior, you know.
Well, also, you know, I picture you on this scene, and I always thought you're an attractive young lady, and these men are creeps. Men are all still creeps, and so I just think here you are at the Mask booking bands. I have to think every guy is coming on to you.
Well, it was, yes, it was a very, there was a lot of alcohol. It was a very sexualized situation, and I was not prepared. And I probably, one of the few things that played to my advantage was that I was somewhat of a tomboy. I very much tried to be one of the guys, roadied for bands, tried to help move equipment, tried to become, because I wanted to meet people who played music and join bands and stuff like that. I tried to fall into more of a one of the guys kind of.
And maybe having a big brother?
Huh?
Maybe having a big brother also, like maybe.
Well, yes, but I was a tomboy from the time I was, 5. I chopped all my hair off to be like Twiggy the model because she had short hair. Nobody had short hair. I mean, I going way back, there was a tendency on my part to eschew the girly girl kind of approach, and I think that became, like I said, a little bit to my advantage, that I wasn't playing the risque girly girl most of the time.
Right. Okay. So we talked for 45 minutes so far. I haven't shown a single picture. I haven't got into a lot of stuff, but listen, we're learning. I got to say, you ever get the feeling you've been cheated? 1977, you're playing, 1978, you're playing in the band Wax with 2 X's. You guys take a trip to San Francisco. You're going to go to the Winterland, and you are going to see a band. You're a fan of a band called The Avengers, which is one of those bands that's known as one of the great unrecorded bands. Were you? And they're opening for the Sex Pistols. This will become the Sex Pistols' last show ever, and one of the most historic shows. And if you're a historian of the Sex Pistols, it's one of the only shows where Sid Vicious's bass is turned on for the entire show. He was probably getting a little bit better. I mean, he's playing root notes, but he was getting a little bit better at the end. And nobody could have known that was going to be the end. But get the feeling you've been cheated is not just what the Sex Pistols said at the end of their set. Tell me your experience with that concert.
Well, so the opening bands, was the Avengers and the Nuns, who weren't, I wasn't as familiar with them, and they were all right, but the Avengers were one of my favorite bands, so that was awesome, and we had gotten pretty close to the stage, and then when the Sex Pistols came on, this thing that, happens at gigs is that the crowd starts to sort of move forwards towards the back of the crowd, starts moving forward towards the stage. And there is sort of this crush effect that happens, and bouncers are standing on the stage, sort of peeling off, the front row as they get smashed up against the stage. And I tried very hard to pay attention to Sid's playing because I was curious. And what I would tell you is he played the root note, and he was very good at, it seemed to me, sort of hitting the downbeat. So he would get these big strokes and just hit the downbeat of the bass line. So good for him. But eventually I got kind of stuck, trampled under because the crush kept happening. And I was wearing punk rock clothes. I think I had a chain and it was getting pulled, and I was being stepped on, and it felt unsafe. It was bad. And I struggled against it a little bit and got out and left because I felt hurt, and just went and sat by the car outside.
Kira, you hear people talk about my parents, they went to Woodstock. You hear these stories. To me, being at the last Sex Pistols show was one of the coolest things in the world. And the fact that you didn't get to see all of it, is very punk rock.
But we went to a party afterwards, and Sid did show up.
So what was that like?
Look, I was lying in a beanbag chair hurt, like I said, like, oh, there's Sid. That was about what it was like. I knew he was there, but I was not feeling good, and I was a little bit beat up, and, and he was certainly drunk, and I had certainly been drinking, and so again, I was just sort of tagging along. I was with a group of people. They went to that party. Sid showed up. They left. We left.
Yeah, no, it's a it's a cool story and the moment in time. I want to get back to Darby a little bit because there are some parallels between Sid's life and Darby's life. Maybe not intentional, but there are. But first, I want to show this photo here, and it's a little small, but I'm sure you remember it. So tell me who's in this photo.
Okay, so that's it's kind of an all-star band that we put together, except I wasn't an all-star. I just happened to be in a band with Nikki at the time, Nikki Beat on the drums, who had been in the Weirdos, who was not in the Weirdos at this time. He was in a band with me called the Monsters. Behind me, I'm the girl. Behind me is my brother, sort of the farthest back, and then in front of us is Darby Crash singing and Stanley from the Dickies playing guitar. And our deal was just to take some of these big bands, the Screamers. My brother was in the Screamers, Darby was in the Germs, Stanley was in the Dickies, and Nikki had been in the Weirdos, and create this sort of all-star band. Why they couldn't have I mean, they could have easily had a bass player who mattered too. But I usurped the position, and we played a song kind of from each band, you know, played some greatest hits.
This is kind of ahead of its time too. Like, I didn't know
this was at the New Mask, because the Mask did eventually get shut down, and for a little while the same guy who ran the Mask tried to have shows at this other facility. And it was like a New Year's thing. I think we were trying to, you know, help get the New Mask going. So it was almost like a charity event. I don't know.
How funny. And I did ask you before we started recording if you could find Nikki Beat for me, because he becomes Nikki Beat Alexander, and he is the drummer on the first LA Guns record. And so I thought he'd be an interesting interview, because I don't think I grew up I knew about him as a rock drummer before I knew him as a pretty legendary punk drummer, and I know he's got some stories to share as well. So
I'm sure he does.
I have a few questions about Darby, and you know, people become legendary, but it doesn't put a human spin on these people, and yeah, there's documentaries, there's a movie, you know, there's all kinds of things, but for you, tell me a little bit about what he was like.
I would say, I mean, he was hugely intelligent, which is part of his downfall in a way, because he felt everything, he understood things, and it's part of why his lyrics are just wildly creative and cool, because that was his outlet for his mind. But I think that, I mean, like a lot of us, probably a very sensitive human who didn't fit with even punk rockers. Really, he didn't fit without ingesting everything he could, you know, didn't feel comfortable around people, really somewhat of a depressive personality at times. And misunderstood, you know, not a great home life, not terrible, but not great.
He lost a half brother to heroin at a young age, and I believe his father passed away also.
Yeah, and there was not a lot of money, you know, and his mom was somewhat unavailable, and you know, just a rough go from early times, and I mean, he had a twinkle in his eye. He found things humorous, and he would play games. And I remember one time being at his house. I was still in junior high at the time. My friend and I had dropped acid and went to his house, and he fed us cherries, you know. And he kind of knew how to toy with people on acid, because acid was one of the early, you know, and experiments that he and others would imbibe before getting heavily into drinking and later other drug use. But I think that, you know, connections were really hard. He had a few close people and found it difficult to connect with a lot of others. And as things got sort of animated in the drug use and stuff, some people, including myself, to be honest, would, keep a wall up. It's very hard to watch someone destroy themselves with drugs, and there's nothing you can do. And that helpless feeling has caused me to pull back from several people I cared greatly for, and he was certainly one. And the night he OD'd, he was trying to get me to stick around the Hong Kong cafe where the gig was that night, and I gotta go.
Yeah,
I was studying at UCLA and stuff. So, I was always trying to get home and go to sleep and study. I was a little bit of a goody two shoes compared to a lot of the people in the scene. So there was a part of me that just had to pull out.
Yeah. And of course, you're going to say, what if, everybody has that. There comes a point when you realize you can't say what if, because you can't change things. He obviously, like you said, had trouble fitting in. Do you think that he was a closeted homosexual? That's one of the things that's out there. A lot of people
not particularly closeted, I wouldn't say. Like I said, he had very close people, and and those people within his circle kind of understood where he was. He was almost asexual. He was not really wanting to be, he wasn't partnered up with people in a formal sense. But I wouldn't call it closeted. I would just call it something that he just didn't, it wasn't an important thing, flag to wear for him. It was just part of who he was. And
yeah.
And truthfully, he was very good at keeping himself to himself. Even though I was pretty close up, I didn't know the details and the ins and outs of things. He had very close women in his life, and he had very close men in his life, so.
I ask because in the Decline of Western Civilization, there's an arranged scene that he's living with a woman that he wasn't living with, and probably a friend.
He was a very close friend. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. But I think they try to imply that this is his girlfriend. And listen, it's a different time. So we're talking about this last show. They would do these reunions and things with Pat Smear, the Germs members. And Pat says that he used to always say, I'm just going to play this show so I can get enough heroin to kill myself. And Pat thought, like most people, he always says that.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you, so that night he goes to, her name is Candy Cola, right? That's her character name. And they go to her parents' house. And and the story is that they had a suicide pact. I want to ask you if you believe that.
Well, I think, frankly, I don't know. I can tell you that from my own experience, I never thought I would live past 25. I think a lot of us felt there was not much point in becoming a grown-up, so I certainly believe that he wasn't concerned about the future or about who he was going to be when he grew up, or anything like that. And I think he may well have accepted that any given usage of heroin could be his last. But I don't know the formality of it. That the talk certainly after the fact was that he had manipulated the situation and so that he could commit suicide and got enough to do so. I just was one of the people who got called the next day and told this is what he's gone.
And as heartbreaking as it is, there has to be a part of you that expects it. I mean, that can't be shocked, at least.
Well, there were those who we thought were least likely to survive, and I wouldn't say he was necessarily on my list of least likely to survive. As always, there are ones that you're amazed are still around, and there are those that didn't make it for various reasons. So no, I mean, I was surprised because I hadn't had a lot of people close to me die, so sure, it hit like a lead pipe. But I also knew that, these were the risks he took. If nothing else, that it was always a possibility.
Yeah. I don't, I don't know the person, but hearing the stories, the suicide pact story seems, it seems a little contrived to me, and maybe part of folklore. Again, I don't know, but I have been around people who've dealt with addiction. And yes, anytime you use a drug like heroin and someone shoots heroin, they are running a very serious risk. The story goes, and it might be now just this sort of junky Romeo and Juliet story, that he injects her, he injects himself, and then he injects her, and he passes away. She lives. Is she still living?
I don't know. I know that, I mean, she's responsible for some of the information or misinformation, depending on what the truth was. But she claimed to have been disappointed that she survived. And look, when you're in that situation, when you wake up and someone like him is gone, whether or not it was a suicide pact, you're going to have to tell people something, and then, as you say, maybe that folklore gets expanded upon, or maybe she felt folklore was better of an explanation than what really happened, or maybe it is what really happened. Sure. I don't know.
And this is what makes these kind of deaths legendary. And from all I heard, Darby would probably like that, that we're talking about him this many years later. 1979, Sid Vicious passes away at age 21. 1980, Darby Crash passes away at just 20 years of age. It's crazy how many people are lost at such a young age. We consider these people, legends, but they've only been here for 2 decades. And then for those who don't know, John Lennon dies the next day, and any press or whatever about Darby is now John Lennon. I think Farrah Fawcett died the same day as Michael Jackson, and one then takes over. Not to say that Darby was as famous, but it could have been a news story, because I think at that time also everyone wanted to make the punk scene into bad guys,
But it was still very small. It's hard for people now to get that it was still a really sort of underground scene. So it would not have been big news.
Right. That's what I think. Because they say this.
And there might have been, punk rock singer dies, but it would have been someone nobody really in the big scheme of things knew anything about,
Yeah. To say that John Lennon, wiped away his headlines probably is a little inaccurate. Yeah. But it also makes for that folklore. Anyway, I'm glad that
it was a tough week.
Yeah.
For those of us who were close to Darby, it was a tough week, because the John Lennon thing was so senseless and painful as a human being, just to feel that, someone creative like that would get blown away. It's sort of that was just a part of the sign of the times that was, part of what was creating punk rock, was this, what was going on in the bloody world.
Yeah, absolutely. And people still go visit his grave, and they've made a shrine out of visiting the room that he died in. It's this legend has lived on for good or for bad. We've talked about everybody else's career, but now we got to really dive into yours. But before I do that, I got a list of names. One of my heroes, Stiv Bators. Tell me how you, Stiv Bators, the singer for the band Dead Boys, that was very underrated, but you know what? The younger generation has kind of latched on to Dead Boys. It's a funny thing. There's not many survivors. Cheetah Chrome is still around, still plays. What's it like? What's Stiv Bators like?
Oh, he was a sweetheart. I know it sounds weird, but he was just a really sweet guy. Look, my relationship with him was very strange, in that after the first, we met once and got to talking, and he, being from out of town, one of the concerns of the day is how do we get a hold of some drugs, right? And I happened to be able to facilitate something. I don't remember which time, you know, then from then on, each time he came to town, there was some activity in that kind of vein, you know, where there would be, there was an interest in drugs. There was an interest in, he and I dropped acid once, and went and broke into some construction site, and you know, we're on acid, and decided to go back to the hotel room in the morning, and he wanted to dose the rest of the band.
Mm-hmm. Which band?
And I was the provider of the acid, really.
Which band? Was it Dead Boys?
The Dead Boys.
Okay. Yeah.
And then he, you know, he doses them without them knowing and tells them about it after they've drank their morning orange juice, you know. And I'm just standing there, you know, feeling mortified because, of course, you know, I'm to blame, I guess, because I supplied.
Yeah, you're the hookup.
And I, you know, and this does not mean I was a drug dealer. I mean, I was just someone local, so he knew that I might be able to come up with something. I was not at all a drug dealer.
No, well, that's what happens. People come into town, and people do, yeah.
Yeah, you just, if you, whoever you know, you might. Anyways, so that was one bit. We met a handful of times when they were in town, and he was just he was a sweet guy, and another one who died too young.
Yeah, and his story though is not like he did not OD, you know, and he was also known as a very nice guy. Most people really enjoyed him. Whereas Johnny Thunders and these kind of guys kind of had this dark, angry side to their use. Stiv Bators gets hit by a car in France and goes back to his hotel and passes away.
Yeah.
Was this
D. Boone was very young too.
Yeah, well, we're going to get to D. Boone from the Minutemen. I'm going to speed it up. So there's so many of these iconic people, and your life is so. That's why I told you to write a book. After this interview, though, you've said it all. Okay, so after the Germs, you play in a band called Twisted Roots with Pat Smear, also, right?
Not after the. Pat joined Twisted Roots. Yeah, I was in other bands along the way, but my brother's band, Twisted Roots, was the first incarnation that I played with was with Pat and with a guy named Emil, who eventually played in Black Flag, the drummer, and Maggie, who I went to 12th grade with and turned on to punk rock. Yeah.
Now, this is where it gets crazy, because Black Flag has all these strange incestuous links to each other and all around it. So I'm going to move ahead. You're playing the band DC3 with Des Cadena. Des is the guitar player and singer at one point in Black Flag. That's before. Mm-hmm. Now they tell you that they, and let's also mention, around this time, you're dating Henry Rollins for a short time.
Right. I dated him for a few months, 6 months maybe. And then they went off to Europe, their first Europe tour, and I had joined DC3. And I had known those guys, you know, so I joined DC3. I was not in DC3 for very long because we practiced at the same place, and I get a call from Henry saying, Chuck's out of the band. You want to play, you know, there's not going to be anything between us. I'm like, yeah, I know.
Which is funny because he's young too. It's not like he's this older guy and you're this young.
No, it was just, I mean, the breakup had not been particularly, you know, smooth, and he was just.
He went on the road overseas, and when you came back, the relationship was kind of was.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I didn't behave very well while he was gone, in the sense that I was hurt by the fact that he didn't stay in touch, and of course, you know, having now traveled with the band, I know why he didn't stay in touch. But you know, being the girlfriend at home, I was sort of hurt, and I didn't handle it well, and he felt betrayed in a way that I had been hard on him when he had been going through hell, you know. So hindsight is 20/20, but it had been a pretty uncomfortable breakup when I was still into him and he was well done with me. And so he wanted to be clear that if we were to play together, that was very over. And that was just a statement of fact for him. And then I stayed after practice. and jam with them.
Yeah, he still wanted you in the band. You know what I mean?
Well, I don't know if he wanted me in the band. I don't know, really. The strange thing is they acted like they didn't know anything about this, but hey, sure, we'll jam, you know. And then they asked me to join the band afterwards, you know. So it was very serendipitous. It just happened, you know. Well, it's just one of those weird things which, you know, I'm not even sure how it happened. It all kind of just, things in life seem to sometimes just fall into place, and you look back on it and you go, boy, that could have easily not happened that way, but it just happened. You know, I said, hey, I'm at UCLA. I want to finish school. And they were like, well, work around your school schedule. If you know, will you take time off to tour? And, you know, we had a quick little logistical discussion, and that was it.
Yeah, it's funny. So you rehearse with Des, then you go over, you cross the hall or whatever. Rehearse.
No, same room.
Yeah,
they
same
leave.
room. Perfect.
Greg and Bill show up. My amp's still set up.
This is like the Black Flag All-Stars. And so you... They say, why not join the band? He gets Otter, the bass player, Chuck, then becomes the manager of the band.
Well, look, that band, and I think people know this who know about the band, but it was a pretty lifetime investment. You know, it was a serious touring, you know, machine. And in that way, it made some sense that it was hard for Chuck to just walk away from something that he had invested, you know, so much in. And I think that in that way, he still wanted to be a part of it. He became a manager of sorts. He was booking the tours, and his band SWA played on some of the touring with us. And it was, like you said, incestuous.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I will tell you that I when I was growing up in New York, I had a casual knowledge of Black Flag. I did not know that there was a female bass player. When you look at this picture, I think the average, which one doesn't belong, you know? And that is the most punk rock thing of all. The fact that here you are, this young woman playing with these really crazy kind of punk guys.
Well, look, I had been a punker for years, and they had seen me play in Twisted Roots and other bands. So it was not that strange. And I mean, Bill was younger than I was, you know, so it wasn't there, the age gap. Yeah. Henry is the same age as me. Greg and Chuck were a little bit older, but I mean, you could see Bill's just a kid too. Mm-hmm. I mean, I had been living on my own for years and years, you know. Bill's still kind of crashing at his parents' house, you know, his mom's or his dad's house. And that was just part of the.
But you're playing these shows where people are slam dancing. Henry Rollins looks like Tarzan. He's wearing nothing but his shorts, and there is a tough crowd. People are throwing, you know, it's a what, and here you are just dealing. I guess your punk rock background, you were prepared for it.
Well, I mean, no, yes and no. I mean, there were some times in Europe where things got kind of rough. I mean, when we showed up there, the last thing they had seen was, you know, skinhead Henry, and there they are. I've got the shortest hair of the band, and I'm a girl, and we're playing the B-side of My War, you know, like we're playing the some slower, heavier songs, and they're, you know, they're not happy. And dropping beer cans on my head and stuff, you know, but I'm
fascinated by Black Flag because you also had instrumental shows, which is so odd to me.
It's funny because the first time I played with those guys, with Greg and Bill, we were playing instrumentals. You know, Henry was not there, and we didn't play singing songs. We jammed on some of those riffs that eventually became instrumentals in the band. I think in some ways, and it's easy for me to not talk about, but you know, the rift, if there was one with Chuck, had to do with a sort of stylistic thing, and the instrumentals may have been, you know, a part of sort of the transition. So I think that for Greg and Bill, whether or not and how I played in those kinds of songs, you know, was a big factor. What could I hold down the fort and play the riff insanely long and hard and steady while, you know, they had fun, you know, and that was just a test, if you will, and the instrumental stuff was something that Greg, I think, you know, Greg liked to play. Usually we would practice, you know, 4 or 5 hours until, you know, Henry would drop after 2, me and Bill would drop after 5, and Greg would keep playing. You know, he's a guitar player. It's not as physical, you know, and he just loves to jam and loves to play. So he would, you know, he wanted that additional music time that was over and above the singing songs, and that was important to him. We would go to sound check and he would want to jam for a while on tour because, you know, we didn't get to play as many hours as he wanted, you know, and so he'd want to get some extra playing in.
Yeah, imagine that. Yeah, that is, it's a different kind of punk rock. You know, some of these bands, like, how short can we get the songs? You guys started having some pretty long songs and changing the style. So here's one of the things that is so insane about your time in Black Flag. This has definitely marked out a legacy with you. It's only 2.5 years of your life. You've done so much more. But in that 2.5 years, why not release 7 records? I believe 4 studio albums, right? And then
there were 3 sort of traditional Black Flag records, 2 instrumental records, and 2 live records. Basically, I mean, that was the meat of the release. There was some compilation stuff, but
when I interview people, I'm impressed when I'll go, "Oh, you put a record out each year," you know. And I hear a band and I go, "Well, you had one in 88, 89." I go, "That's amazing." Yeah. Now this is real, but talk about these records are made in 48 hours. Is that right?
Well, we would do a 48-hour lockout, and yeah, I think every time we were trying to record basic tracks for 2 records usually, and that's just for basic tracks. That's just, you're basically trying to get the drums and bass laid down. Greg would lay down scratch guitar, and so the focus is on getting the bass and drums recorded for 2 records. And inevitably during those 48-hour lockouts, I'm also studying for midterms. I don't know how, but we always have it scheduled the week before UCLA midterms are happening. So I'm always studying. When we can't possibly play anymore during the 48 hours, I have to sit down and study until we play some more.
It's completely crazy, yeah, that you're juggling. But you're probably smarter than most, because you're not, hey, I'm going to go all in on this punk, although you were, but I'm also going to make sure I put this much effort into UCLA. I'm going to keep it. So we've got a young lady in the band. Why not put out a politically correct record like this one here? Slip it in. Spinal Tap-ish maybe. But and Greg's brother was the artist for Black Flag. He's got a fake name. There's a lot of fake names with Black Flag. Greg also played bass on some of the early stuff under another name. But but these covers are meant to be a little bit shocking.
Well, I mean, Raymond is Raymond. You know, it took me, of course, it's in hindsight again easier to put it all in perspective. But he's, you know, my first reaction was sort of like, well, why do you have a girl in the band if you hate girls? But you know, this is Raymond expressing himself, and I think that as I spent more time with not only the band but him, you know, you come to kind of understand the big picture of it, and it isn't. I mean, hating women it's a little simplified of a statement, and I, you know, yeah, shock value to have a girl, I guess. I mean, I don't think they went out of their way to get a girl. I happened to be, yes, you know, kind of around, and I happened to be able to play kind of the way they were looking for me to play for some time, you know. But the artwork, you know, is it's Raymond, you know, and you have to explore some of Raymond's work to start to see the sort of depth of the emotion behind it. It's not it may seem simplified, but it's not.
Yeah, for sure. And look, his artwork has become quite legendary, and he's still an artist. He creates, you know, more than just Black Flag, obviously. It's funny when I usually talk about this, I talk about each year the record came out, slip it in 1984, but your first record with him, Family Man, also 1984. Might as well put out a live record, call that Live 84. The process of weeding out, 1985, why waste any time? And since we're in 1985, In My Head, you'll put that one out too. 1986 will be the last record. This comes out after you're out of the band. It's called Who's Got the 10.5.
Wait, you missed one.
I did?
Loose Nut. Loose Nut. Another studio album.
And that was one of the ones I was looking forward to saying the most, to be honest with you. Yeah, also 1985, Loose Nut. Yeah.
Yes.
It's
3 records that year. Nothing
wrong with being sexy. You know, a very Spinal Tap. So, but yeah, it's amazing that you guys crank these things out. And
Who's Got the 10.5 was recorded in 1985 as well.
Right. And you're out of the band when that happens. You know, I was trying to figure out by looking at these pictures, was your hair shorter when you joined and got longer towards the end?
Yes, my hair was shorter when I joined, and then in 1985, well, that's when I'm 17. I'm in Twisted Roots at that time. That's way earlier.
So your hair's changed lengths. Okay, this is pre-black.
Right. That I was still in high school, but
I won't say you look hot then. It's politically.
It's okay. it happens to be a good picture. It's one of the few. The 1985 look was, you know, Henry made this crack when we did the photo shoot before the 1985 tour with Anthony, when we had the new drummer. And I got a little bit dressed up, and he said, oh, it'd be really cool if you just got decked out for the whole tour, you know. And I said, well, if I had a little bit of money, I could do this, you know. So they gave me a couple $100, and I created this sort of look. I dyed my hair purple and wore makeup and heels and lace, and just, you know, tried to completely shake up the Kira facade of, you know, prior tours. So my hair's a little bit longer and purple in the 1985.
Okay, so now, one of the times opening on the road for Black Flag, DC3 at one time, your brother's in that band. Your brother's now on the bill supporting you. He was in the band before. Strange, more of that incestuous stuff. Also, at one point, Minutemen.
No, he joined DC3 to replace me initially. Yeah,
after you. But then he also ends up on the same bill as you, right?
Yes, they did us a leg of the long 4-month 85 tour. The southern leg was DC3, and we did a version of Twisted Roots with Dez and Paul and I. Because why not, right?
Yeah,
play some more.
The circle of life. Also supporting you guys at some point, Minutemen. And
the first week of that tour, Minutemen played, yeah.
Is that when you start to develop some sort of feelings with Mike Watt?
We spent quite a bit of time together during that, and I played his bass and we just got to talking. Our first discussions were somewhat creative. He asked me to write some lyrics for him, which I sent home from the road, and then he flew out to Minneapolis to see me. So there was, you know, there were the beginnings of a relationship, but it was, like I said, somewhat of a slow forming thing, because he's a bit of an odd duck, and I was, you know, up to my eyeballs in touring, so it wasn't a quick moving thing.
Yeah, I could see that. In 1985, they asked you to leave Black Flag, even though you're about to graduate and would have had all the time in the world. They decided
that wasn't the problem.
Yes, no, I get it.
It wasn't my bass playing, and it wasn't my availability.
So what would you say it is?
Hang on just a sec.
Okay.
Tim, I'm still doing this interview. Okay. FYI. So, well, and when you spend a lot of time on the road with people, it's sort of like a marriage of four people. It's the chances of it holding together emotionally, you know, are pretty complicated, you know, and I think it has much to do with just being sick of me. You know, we were overtired, and I'm sure I was a bitch, and you know, I own that, and and they didn't want to have me around anymore. And that's exactly what Chuck said. They don't want to play with you anymore. And and Chuck had the conversation with me, and then he offered me a very small amount of money to buy me out. And I said, no, it would have to be this other larger amount of money. And he said no. And so
that interests me that you turned it down. You said you wanted your amp, and you got that, but
yeah,
you turned down the buyout. Now they wanted to erase you though. So you just
they wanted to not have to pay me royalties, and you know, Henry had started to do, you know, this was my perspective at the time. Henry had started to do some acting and stuff. You know, you just never know, and I wasn't so hard up for money. I mean, I knew, you know, I was finishing up a computer career. My focus wasn't how am I going to take care of myself now that I'm out of Black Flag, you know. Had it been, then like $8,000 or something would have seemed like a lot of money, but it didn't really seem like a lot of money. And the figure I asked for was quite a bit larger than that, and they didn't have that, and that was fine. I wasn't really trying to get bought out.
It's smart that you stuck to that, though. I think as a young person, that's not always you know, and also things like publishing and royalties, they're very new. And like you said, you don't know. Maybe Henry Rollins becomes a movie star. Maybe one of these songs ends up in a movie. And
maybe punk rock becomes a household thing.
Right. Maybe this thing is going to.
Exactly. I mean, exactly. There was, I mean, I didn't really know what would happen, but it you know, and it was not an easy conversation. It was not something where I wanted to just go, oh, sure, whatever you guys want. You know, I was heartbroken. You know, I knew I was out of the band before the conversation. Actually, the last gig we played in San Diego, I knew I was out of the band. I knew it was my last gig, and I was sad, you know. So I wasn't anxious to have them kick me out the door, and it just, you know, so I wasn't going to be compliant to their wishes.
Yeah, someone just broke into your house, Kira.
Yeah, he's in the background here you are on YouTube.
That's all right. As long as you know him, that it's okay.
My husband.
Yes.
Luckily, it's my husband.
Okay, that's a good
thing. And we're actually lucky the dogs didn't bark more.
I'm surprised. Yeah, I've seen your dogs. Now, so do you still see royalties from that Black Flag?
I do. There was a period of time where there actually weren't a lot of royalties, but a little bit of legal finagling that some of the people involved helped out enormously with, resulted in things being a little more
accounting more on the up and up.
Yeah, a little more on the up and up these days, and things seem to have normalized.
Yeah, because you did write songs. You brought songs into Black Flag.
A couple of them, but they're mostly performance royalties.
Yeah. Okay. Now, so in 1985, singer for the Minutemen, D. Boon, tragically passes away. He's in an accident in a van. He's sleeping in the back of the van. They hit something, a cylinder, something goes out on the van. Back door opens, and he is thrown out and dies instantly. Tragic. He's also 27 years old. D. Boon is in that 27 club for whatever, you know, horribly. And so at this point, you and Mike Watt are dating at this point, right?
We're dating. I was actually visiting my mom at the time when Mike called and told me, and we had been dating, exactly correct. And when I got home, I mean, I was very concerned about him. Mike is a really sensitive, emotional guy, you know, and D. Boon was not only his best friend, but his career, you know. And so in an instant, all of that was gone. He'd also lost his father within 6 months. So it was a terrible time, and I was concerned about him playing the bass. I wasn't sure he would. So I started trying to get him to play. I had these bedtime stories that I had recorded for my nephews where I sort of created these intertwining bass lines because I moved to Connecticut for a year. And so I had these sort of noodling ideas of two basses, and I started to do, push Mike to let's just mess around with these or jam or, just in the room. I mean, he didn't want to leave the room for a long time. He didn't go to the memorial. I don't blame him. But that just wasn't his cup of tea. And he,
everybody, yeah.
He just, we just hunkered down basically for a while.
Yeah, and I can imagine, and you're lucky to be in each other's lives at that point. You're leaving Black Flag. He's dealing with this tragedy. You guys get married. I believe you get married in 1987, and yes. And the band Dose. You guys have two bass players, that's also very punk rock. And Mike is, for the people who don't know, is very influential in his contributions to the Minutemen and also Firehose, not Firehouse, but Firehose. And so for you guys to play bass, it sounds like this indulgent thing, but you guys make it work, and it's.
It is indulgent. We were just very clear. If we were going to have two bass players, we pretty much had to not have anybody else, or we wouldn't have any room. Two bass players take up a lot of room as far as we were concerned. We needed the space. Mike's playing was always, pretty dominant in the bands that he was in. So, if he was going to have another bass player, we needed the room. It was sort of went without saying that we didn't have room for anybody else.
Yeah, you guys eventually get divorced, and Mike had some serious health scares of his own, and thankfully he's here and better. But the band goes on. You date Henry Rollins. The band you join Black Flag. You marry Mike.
Well, I told you that this element of sort of one of the guys thing is very much of my personality. Is like one of the reasons that the all-girl band was such a fiasco is because they didn't seem to treat being in a band the way I perceive being in a band, like the way guys tend to treat it is like, it's kind of like work, and you just go and you don't complain about having to go to practice, and you just show up and you just take care of business, and sort of, so that, the personal relationships were kind of separate from the work that was, and frankly, with Dose, it gave us a context. I had made a lifelong commitment to Mike, so there was no. It was actually helpful for me to have a context in which to have the relationship, because it felt pretty tough to break the relationship up. So having something to sort of hang on to allowed that emotional commitment to sort of exist. With a way of expressing ourselves in a context that was separate from the part that wasn't working.
Sure. Yeah. You never had children, Kira? Was it something you just didn't want?
I went through a period of time after my marriage where I thought about it pretty seriously, but it was just never something that it's not even that I didn't want it. It was just not something that was so important that I was going to do what it took to, basically be a single parent and go through the artificial insemination and raising a kid on my own. And at the time that I was turning, running out of room, childbearing years, it would have involved me having to sacrifice a lot. And I guess I wasn't made that way, but it wasn't a conscious, I don't want to do this. It was, I'm not like these women who I had met and run into who were going to do it sort of at any cost. And when I realized that I didn't have that level of commitment to it like I do to some other things, then it became clear that it probably was best that I not go down that road.
Yeah, and if looking back at your childhood, think of all the bullets you dodged, Kira. Your kids might be hanging out at parties with Billie Eilish or whoever the the hot sensation.
Oh, I'd have been a really harsh mom. I'm a pretty strict dog mom.
Oh, I'm sure. Believe me, you after what you've seen, I would be strict too. I want to close the book on music, and we'll talk about sound editing real quick, and then I'll let you go back to your life. I'm sorry that usually I do these interviews and I go, I just can't wait till this person's done. But I got to say, truly interested in your story, and it's a great one.
Thank you.
So you're welcome. Let's talk about Black Flag present day. Okay, right now there's a band called Black Flag that has Greg Ginn in it, and he did create Black Flag, and then he is the only classic or original member. Then there's a band called Flag, and Flag has your potpourri. They're just missing you of Black Flag former members: Keith Morris, former singer; Des Cadena, former singer and guitar player; Chuck Dukowski, who was the bass player before you and became a manager; and then Bill Stevenson, who was the drummer during your years. To me, as a consumer, I think I would rather see that band, but maybe see them both. I want to know what you think.
Well, I saw Flag's first show at the Moose Lodge in Redondo Beach because I hadn't seen those guys in a while, and I wanted to support the scene, if you will. I mean, look, I have mixed emotions. I think it's awesome that Black Flag folks get the kind of acknowledgement now that they frankly didn't get back then. I mean, we were poor the whole way through, right? And punk rock was tiny. So the fact that now in this context, when punk rock is big, that you know, that there's interest and backing is wonderful for these guys. But for me personally, the bands, the sort of rehash bands that come back and go on tour, you know, sort of after having been broken up, you know, the general concept of that, of sort of like getting back together and going on the road after, you know, it's one thing to be the Rolling Stones and they're playing the whole time, you know, but there's some bands that kind of went away and came back, went away and go. I just, for me, you know, moving forward seems like more interesting. And I'm not that interested in going back and seeing the old songs per se of any given band. Like I said, I love that they're out there, that they get acknowledged for an amazing.
I was prepared for you to say this.
Okay.
So
I mean, that being said, I did a Twisted Roots reunion thing. I didn't want to. I said no. And then the bass player crapped out in the 11th hour, and I couldn't do it to those guys.
Well, I'm going to be the devil's advocate here and say that there are people who are much younger, and they've never had a chance to experience it. And I know it's not the same, but to hear those songs, it keeps those songs alive. I know that's a bit of nostalgia, and a lot of bands are sort of living off their legacy, but there are so many young people who I think really it's something special to them. I'll tell you, I saw the Sex Pistols here in Las Vegas at the Hard Rock Hotel. I was wondering if this could be any good. It was the final show they ever played in America. And I'll tell you, it was great. It was like seeing the Rolling Stones of punk rock, because I didn't believe it was actually happening. I saw Dee Dee Ramone.
I mean, I get it. I mean, but Black Flag was notoriously about moving on. They moved on from their original sound and pushed the envelope to move forward. And the process of weeding out, the whole concept of this is, if you don't like it, go away. We'll have someone new come listen, you know? So I don't know. Like I said, the idea of joining a retro band was just not, for me personally, necessarily, you know, I'm curious what people want to do that's new. I have my first solo record coming out. You know?
Yes, which I think is really amazing. You've been working on it for a while on your own. Pandemic gave you some time
No, I mean, frankly, this stuff has been in the works for years, and my brother and I have did a lot of it together, and a lot of it was done, the music part of it. But the studio he works for now has a label, and my brother was instrumental in sort of talking me into doing a release. And hey, I'm 60. I'm releasing my first solo record,
So now, Kira, where do people, is social media the only way people can learn about you? There's no website or anything, is there?
It's not out yet,
okay.
So I don't have a release date. It is called Just Kira. I have a layout. I have finished material, so it's somewhat imminent. The record label is called Kitten Robot. That's the studio my brother works at. It's also now the record label, and they're kind enough to be putting it out. So yeah, right now, social media will be how I would announce it, but I think there's going to be press, probably. Yeah. I think there'll be a little press. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, I think it's exciting. You're not doing it to get rich. You're doing it because you believe in it.
It's kind of exciting. Yes.
How great. And yeah, to get to play music again. And this is sort of like you were saying, you would rather move forward than to go back and play the same Black Flag song.
I've been playing bass longer than I've been a woman, and the music keeps moving along. Whether or not y'all hear it, that's the only difference. I have, piles of music. I recorded music this morning. It's a continuum.
And if I didn't waste your time, you'd be recording music right now.
This record is a point in time, again, a set of years, and represents a thing, and things will keep moving past that.
Yes, moving forward. You're not partaking in a Black Flag reunion. Okay, we got that. When's the last time you talked to Henry Rollins?
Dose did last time I saw him, I think, was that Dose played a benefit. He was active in a charity that is trying to get water to towns in Africa that have no water, and it was a benefit in that vein. And then I heard from him. I got an email from him after the quote unquote Academy Award, which I did not win. My team won. My supervisors have the hardware, but I was involved in, and he had heard that I had won an Academy Award. So he wrote me. I think I wrote him. There was a documentary that Dave Grohl put out that I appear in, and I was interviewed for, and Dave was asking for pictures of me in the van, so to speak. Yeah. And so I touched base with Henry, trying to find photos. So we're in touch, yearly, every couple years, with some kind of business. But that's
a nice thing. I mean, and you're a sound editor. One of these days, you might get a movie that Henry Rollins is in. I got to read some of your credits real quick and let you go.
Sure.
You are a 2-time Emmy Award winner. You worked on the movie as a sound editor, I believe, Mad Max Fury Road. The movie, the sound department won an Academy Award. You were part of that. So while you may not have the actual statue, it's still very, very impressive that the punk rocker from Black Flag just happens to be part of an Oscar-winning team. Some of the movies that you've worked on, here we go. Well, TV show, Game of Thrones. That's one of the ones you got an Emmy for.
I have that hardware.
Where do you keep that, by the way?
We have a little spot with a couple Emmys on there.
Yeah, well, hey, if you got a couple Emmys, I've got like a Ramon's lunchbox and some toys. You got something going. Although I did have this day named after me here in Las Vegas. I should point that out. If we're bragging, I'm going to get in on this. The Joker movie, you worked on that. Aquaman, A Star is Born, The Mummy, Ted 2, Man of Steel. You are either a dialogue editor or an ADR supervisor. To me, this sounds like the most boring line of work possible. I have some background in film. I could not imagine. I can't stand editing. It is a special person who can do any kind of editing. You sit alone and it's meticulous. So first of all, explain to people who don't know what you do.
You won't be surprised that actually dialogue editing and ADR somewhat are dominated by women. And I think there is a distinction in the sense that I've come across a couple of industries in which meticulous, detail-oriented work seems to be, lean a little more feminine. And I'm not sure why, but that detail-oriented, painstaking work, you're not alone in feeling that that's not your cup of tea. Male sound effects and stuff like that, much more male-dominated part of sound. So dialogue editing is one of those, like, what do you do what is that? And what happens, of course, is when they record on the set, you have a scene, and that scene will be recorded in 25 different ways, right? The same scene, the same basic set of dialogue, different angles, wide angles, close-ups, right? All these different perspectives. And then the picture editor will gather all of these versions of the scene and cut together a version of the scene which involves different angles and stuff. So like when you're watching, you see these various angles. Well, so now I get the dialogue and it sounds like, right? You have this chopped together set of sentences that have to be turned into something somewhat seamless and sounding like it all happened at the same place at the same time. So a dialogue editor spends a lot of time smoothing out the backgrounds and correcting problems. I basically think of it like a puzzle. Like, how many problems can I solve before the mix? And some of those problems will be solved with ADR, which means automatic dialogue replacement, which means we'll go in the studio and replace it. But most movies, that's just not an option to do in any grand scheme. So you have to make the production dialogue work. And if it sounds badly, I have a lot of tools at my disposal. I will swap out syllables from another take to solve a problem of someone slamming something down right on top of the dialogue line, or or a plane goes over and it's supposed to be a period piece or whatever. I mean, the number of problems that occur are infinite. So you're really just trying to see how good you can make it sound.
How do you learn how to do this?
Sorry?
How do you learn how to do this? We drop off with Black Flag and Dose, and then all of a sudden you're a sound editor. Well,
no, I was a computer programmer after college. That's what I had kind of studied, and that's what I did for the first 11 years of my career. And then I actually met a guy who was doing sound for student films, and my brother was composing some music for a student film, and they had me come in and do a bass line. And so I met this guy, and it seemed like this great combination of my computer skills, because we do use computers for this, and my auditory skills in music. It seemed like a good fit. So I basically, twisted the guy's arm to hire me at, a quarter of my salary that I was making computer programming, and quit the computer rat race. Sound familiar? Like my father way back, quit my career and started over at $8 an hour, answering the guy's phones. And how I learned was kind of what I was just talking about. The guys always wanted to do the sound effects and stuff. The dialogue tended to be the stuff they didn't want to do. So there was this niche, there was this need, and I started working with this guy to figure out the skills, and slowly over the years have gotten to be, somewhat successful at it.
Yeah, and I could imagine, like you said, it's a specialty thing. In some ways, I feel like sometimes being a bass player, people want to be the lead guitar player. So there's more gigs for bass players because it's sexier in their mind to be the guitar player. And same thing with sound editing. Once you're in and you're good at it, you're going to be in demand. And obviously, I just read some of the credits. I just picked out the ones that were exciting to me. But you're in demand. And what a great thing to do.
Yes and no. I mean, you're freelance. We all go through periods where for whatever reason we're not getting hired. I do not work for a particular corporation, and therefore there's no guarantee of work. I'm about to finish in the next couple of weeks a project and don't have the next one lined up till fall. So breaks happen. It happens to be good for me because then I can work on music. So, it doesn't hurt me. I'm lucky enough to not be living paycheck to paycheck. So it's okay to have breaks. but the reputation is a big factor of it. So you know, hopefully you earn a reputation of being, you know, not just skilled, but also you need some people skills. In the ADR department, you're working with named actors and with directors, and so you have to present and understand your audience, if you will, which is the difficult part for me because I'm not a social butterfly. But I do kind of get the professional thing, having come from a corporate background in computers. That helped me figure out how to present a corporate image, even when that's not necessarily my nature.
Sure.
And so that's a factor, is you have to be thought of as skilled, but also presentable in terms of how you manage difficult directors, difficult actors, whatever. That all comes into part of it. I've been asked right from the start, well, so how do you deal with difficult directors, you know, by a sound supervisor who wants to hire me? That's, you know, that's their concern, is how you're going to handle these situations.
That's a huge part. Sometimes that's more important than the skill, because you need to have someone who can adapt. And what people might not realize, and you alluded to it though, is sometimes the sound is so bad that somebody has to come in and do the ADR. So you could have someone like Joaquin Phoenix. I'm not saying he's difficult or that you did, but I would think he might be. But you have someone like that.
He was marvelous, and he actually, I'll tell you this funny story.
Yeah,
so he comes in for ADR, and he looks at me and he's like, "You look familiar. Have we met?" And I said, "Well, I am a rock star." Now, I said this because I knew that the director, Todd Phillips, had a background. He actually put out a movie based on a pretty extreme punk rocker named Gigi Allen. So I knew he had some background. And sure enough, when I said that, I was pretty sure he would say, "Oh yeah, I've been meaning to," he was like, "Oh yeah, I've been meaning to ask you about that." And so we had, you know, a very short, quick little, you know, history discussion. And look, it's best when this happens organically, but I have a little bit of street cred, and occasionally that's helpful in this creative field. It was never very helpful in the computer career, but occasionally I'll have a little moment with these creative people where that is actually, you know, an interesting part of, you know, the fact that I'm on the team. I got on The Star Is Born because I had a music background. Not that it was particularly a musical experience actually working on the dialogue, but it did happen to be one of the reasons someone recommended me to the supervisor who was going to do that movie.
Kira, do you ever get a bad movie? And I wouldn't tell you to name any, but do you ever get a bad movie and go, "Oh my God," because you're watching this dialogue over and over, much longer than it was. Do you ever just go, "This is going to be like," do you see?
Well, sure. I mean, look, what I always tell myself, and this is absolutely true, is I can do great work on a bad movie. Like, it doesn't have, the content of the movie is kind of secondary. Great. My success does not depend on it doing well at the box office. My success depends on how I can solve the problem. So if I get a movie with a lot of production problems, I'm working on one right now, which was recorded pretty poorly. It's actually kind of a cool challenge to see, you know, to sort of try to impress the people involved with how much I can do to salvage a really difficult sounding movie. So I try to focus on the technical craft. And of course, once in a while you're working on a really great movie, and it's just a bonus, you know, to listen to great dialogue or to hear really great recorded dialogue, you know, but you try to separate yourself out from it a little bit and concentrate on the technical task at hand, you know.
Well, it's a job also where sometimes you're saving the day. I've worked on projects where people did some pretty awful sound, and you could, if you don't have a budget or find someone like yourself who's good at it, you're in big trouble, because when you're out making a movie, things happen. So anyway, Kira, I got to say, I really appreciate you. I'm a fan of a good story, and your life is a good story. You know, it's all over the place. That's why we took 2 hours to talk about it. And I know you've talked about your life a lot. You're probably sick of it, but I think there are people who will just, there's just so much to dwell on. And what a cool, and it's not over. You got a lot more living to do, but what a cool place to be, the way that your roads have led. So I appreciate you so much for spending this time with me. And I recommend, we'll put in the description some of your music for people to listen to. Black Flag is very easy to find, but some of the stuff like Dose and some of the different things, I think people really get a kick out of it. And we'll keep an eye out for when you have a new record.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Jason. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Kara. Okay, take care.